Step into a world where power, family legacy, and public image shaped relationships far more than personal feelings ever could. In the eyes of ancient Romans, marriage was less a personal vow between two hearts and more a carefully crafted alliance, a strategic partnership designed to secure political ties, social standing, and influence in that world. Getting married wasn't the beginning of a lifelong love story. Instead, it was more like signing a contract, a transaction between families, not individuals. And within that contract, one thing was clear. Loyalty, at least in the romantic sense, was not expected. In fact, Roman husbands were not only allowed to be unfaithful, they were expected to be affairs, were common, accepted, and often public. A man's extramarital relationships, whether short-lived flings or long-term affairs, were rarely seen as scandalous. Many of these relationships were with courtesans, women known for their beauty, wit, and companionship, but not marriage, and no one batted an eye. But here's where it gets even more intriguing. Men in ancient Rome also had romantic and sexual relationships with other men, and this was not just tolerated. It was seen as a normal, even respectable part of Roman life. There was no need for secrecy, no shame attached, and certainly no rigid labels, like gay or straight. As we know them today, you see, Romans didn't define relationships by the gender of the people involved. Instead, they focused on something else entirely: power dynamics in Roman thinking. What mattered most wasn't who you loved, but how the relationship was structured. Who held the power? Who played the dominant role in most male-female relationships? The man was seen as the dominant active partner, the one who led, gave, and commanded the woman. On the other hand, was expected to be passive, submissive, and receiving this same logic applied to male-male relationships. It wasn't the presence of two men in a relationship that drew judgment. It was the role each one played. The dominant partner, often older or more powerful, maintained his masculine status, but the one who took on the more passive or receptive role could face social criticism, especially if he was a grown man. As that role was associated with femininity and submission, to truly understand how the Roman thought about love, desire, and identity, we must first let go of our modern framework in Rome. Marriage, sex, power, and status were intertwined, part of a social system that prioritized control, dominance, and political strategy over emotional connection or moral expectation. And we're just getting started. In a typical man-woman relationship, during Roman times, roles weren't just assumed, they were embedded into the very foundation of society. The man was expected to be the dominant force, the initiator, the giver, the protector. The woman, she was to be the receiver, the one who submitted, supported, and followed. But this wasn't just about romance or biology. It was a performance of social status and control. Now things became more complicated when it came to relationships between men. When two men formed a relationship, Roman society still expected one of them to assume the passive receiver role. This role, viewed as more feminine and submissive, could carry a social stigma, especially if the man in that position was an adult. It challenged the Roman ideal of masculine dominance, but there were exceptions, especially when the younger partner was still a teenager. In those cases, the relationship was seen not only as acceptable, but often as a form of mentorship and personal development. One particularly well-documented form of male-male bonding was pedesty, a structure borrowed from earlier Greek customs. In this arrangement, an older man known as the Orestes formed a close, often intimate relationship with a teenage boy called Theos. But this wasn't just about physical connection. These relationships often included education's guidance and social elevation. The older partner acted as a mentor, helping the younger navigate the complicated world of Roman politics, power, and privilege for all the expectations. Roman society placed on relationships, dominance, and masculine roles. Reality didn't always match the script. Sometimes even the most powerful men defied the very norms they were meant to uphold. Take Julius Caesar, one of Rome's most iconic and commanding figures. Despite his fierce leadership on the battlefield and bold political ambition, rumors swirled in the Roman streets and Senate halls, whispers that Caesar in his private life preferred to take the more submissive role in his same-sex relationships to the Romans. This wasn't just scandalous, it was deeply confusing. How could a man so powerful, so dominant in public, possibly step into a role they viewed as feminine in private? It didn't fit the Roman mold, and that disconnect made Caesar the subject of relentless gossip, political cartoons, and backroom insults in a culture obsessed with control. Even a personal detail could shake public perception. Then there was Emperor Hadrian, a ruler who rewrote the rules of love altogether. Though married to a woman, as most emperors were, his marriage was purely political. Many historians believe he had little to no romantic or physical connection with his wife. The real story of Hadrian's heart centered on someone else, a brilliant and striking young man named Antinous. Hadrian didn't just care for Antinous, he adored him. He ensured the young man received the finest education and brought him along on imperial journeys throughout the Roman world together. They explored vast landscapes and powerful cities, forging a bond that went far beyond companionship. But then tragedy struck while traveling through Egypt. Antonius mysteriously drowned in the Nile River. The cause of his death remains unknown to this day. Some whispered it was an accident, others believed it may have been a sacrifice. But what followed was nothing short of astonishing. Hadrian, overcome with grief, immortalized Antinous in ways no emperor had ever done. For a lover, he built an entire city near the site of Antinous' death, naming it Antinopolis. He had the boy's body mummified and returned to Rome, a rare and sacred act he commissioned. Coins bearing Antinous' face had statues carved in his likeness, and most incredibly declared him a god. This was unprecedented. Very few mortals were ever elevated to divine status in Rome, and Antinous became one of them. Worship of the youth spread across the empire, from Egypt to Greece to Rome. Shrines were built, rituals were held, and Hadrian's love story became one of the most legendary in ancient history. But Hadrian was far from the only Roman emperor with a tale that shocked the public. Enter Emperor Nero, a ruler whose love life was as dramatic as his reign. While many emperors kept male lovers discreetly within palace walls, Nero did something no one expected. He married them not once, but twice. In one case, Nero married a former slave named Pythagoras. But here's the twist. Nero played the role of the bride, donning a bridal veil and participating in a full wedding ceremony. Publicly, it was a spectacle that left Rome stunned. How could an emperor, the ultimate symbol of Roman masculinity, choose to publicly portray himself in the submissive feminine role? The confusion was loud and widespread. Rome's rigid expectations didn't allow for that kind of flexibility, especially not in its rulers. Later, Nero took another bold step. He married a young male slave named Sporus, but this time to calm the public and protect his image. Nero played the masculine role. The message was clear. Even an emperor had to walk a fine line between personal passion and public performance behind the curtain of power. Roman emperors lived complex emotional lives, some filled with love, others with grief, and many with contradictions. The expectations placed on them were immense. They were not only rulers, but symbols expected to mirror Roman ideals of strength, dominance, and control in both politics and passion. But the truth, their hearts didn't always follow the script. While Emperor Nero's relationships often defied convention, some of his actions would be deeply unsettling, even horrifying, by today's standards. Perhaps the most disturbing account involves his young partner Sporus in a calculated and cruel decision. Nero had the boy castrated not out of affection or personal desire, but to maintain the illusion of a traditional male-female marriage dynamic by physically altering Sporus. Nero ensured the public saw him not as a boy, but as a symbolic bride, allowing the emperor to assert masculine dominance and social control. This act wasn't isolated. Several ancient sources describe Nero as abusive and manipulative in his romantic entanglements. While it's difficult to know how much is fact and how much is rumor, the pattern of cruelty even in love is hard to ignore. And then there's the most scandalous accusation in Nero's infamous legacy, one that has captivated and disturbed historians for centuries. The claim that Nero committed incest with his own mother, Agrena the Younger. This explosive allegation appears in the ancient writings of Suetonius, the Lives of the Caesars, and more cautiously in Tacitus's Annals. Both suggest that Agrena may have initiated the relationship to maintain her influence over Nero after he rose to power. But most modern historians treat this claim as what it likely was, a politically motivated slander designed to shock, humiliate, and destroy Nero's legacy. You see, in ancient Rome, reputation was everything, and one of the most effective ways to damage it, especially for emperors, was through scandalous accusations. Whether true or not, claims that someone had violated sacred social norms could follow them for generations. For Nero, the infamous rumor about an inappropriate relationship with his mother became a permanent part of his legacy, while modern historians widely agree that this was likely political slander. It shows just how far Roman society would go to discredit a ruler. But if Nero's legacy raised eyebrows, the stories surrounding Emperor Tiberius cast an even longer shadow, as Rome's second emperor Tiberius was known for withdrawing from public life in his later years and retreating to a series of lavish seaside villas, most famously on the island of Capri. There, away from the spotlight of the capital, a wave of rumors emerged about his private lifestyle. Ancient writers described his behavior as eccentric, indulgent, and far removed from traditional Roman values. Some claimed that Tiberius surrounded himself with a young entourage officially brought in to serve the imperial household. But according to these same sources, the emperor's interest in them may have crossed boundaries, at least in the eyes of later historians. These accounts painted him as a ruler who misused his isolation and status. But it's important to remember that many of these tales were likely exaggerated or fueled by political agendas. Roman historians, especially when writing about unpopular leaders, often included dramatic and sensational details, not always to record truth, but to shape legacy. Even so, the stories about Tiberius serve as a reminder of how unchecked power, especially behind closed doors, could lead to suspicion and lasting infamy in ancient Rome. Emperors weren't just leaders, they were larger-than-life figures, sometimes viewed as gods among men with so much power, concentrated in a single individual, personal choices often became political statements. And when rulers stepped outside accepted norms, the consequences could echo across history. The stories of Nero, Hadrian Caesar, and Tiberius remind us that Roman ideas of love, leadership, and legacy were as complex as the empire itself. Behind the grandeur of temples and triumphs lay a world where ambition, reputation, and personal conduct were all woven into the fabric of power,